Well, welcome and thank you for coming to the Writing Committee's Faculty Forum on Syllabi for Writing Instruction Courses. The purpose of this forum is to provide specific examples of how courses can be revised or created to meet the outcomes proposed by the General Education Committee's curricular reform and by the Writing Committee in our proposed requirements for writing instruction courses, and there's a copy of that in your packet of information. The 6 presenters today will demonstrate both interdisciplinary and disciplinary courses representing a diverse range. And to give you some sense of that diversity, 2 courses are for the first semester of the freshman year, 4 courses are for the second semester. The 2 interdisciplinary courses represent both the integrative and the Great Books programs. The 4 disciplinary courses come from 3 departments, represent 3 domains, and satisfy 4 literacy blocks. 2 are survey courses, while 2 are or are more similar to special topics courses. 4 courses are revised from those currently offered, and the packet includes both the revised syllabus and the current one, while 2 courses are newly designed for the proposed gen ed curriculum. But all 6 courses, however, despite their diversity, are writing instruction courses and satisfy the proposed requirements. I want to emphasize that these presentations will show you courses that have not yet been taught and will not be taught for 10 to 14 months. There will no doubt be differences between the syllabus you see today and what students see in part because the curriculum and the writing requirements as well as the courses are in varying stages of development. But another reason for differences is that the presenters designed these syllabi with this form in mind. So, for example, several of the syllabi include instructive comments or examples for your benefit, which would not be retained in the student's copy. Others don't include the calendar of assignments and readings, but do carry the course description and the assignments and outcomes for the course. The purpose then of this forum is not to give you syllabi for courses we have taught, but syllabi which demonstrate ways of imagining how we can teach. And the format for today, each presenter will speak briefly about his or her course and syllabus. Afterwards, there'll be breakout sessions so that you can ask questions and learn more about the particular courses which are relevant or of interest to your own teaching. My assumption is that you will not be teaching all of these courses, but you might be teaching one or something similar to 1 or 2. So at that point, we'll need to rearrange the chairs, go out into 5 different clusters of chairs, and each presenter will meet with individuals who are interested in that particular course or type of course for more discussion and questions. After 15 or 20 minutes, please join another cluster so that people can participate in more than one if they're interested. If you don't get to talk to all the presenters you would like to this afternoon, I'm sure each of us would be happy to meet with you individually at a later time to be a resource and guide as you begin imagining your own courses. And there will be 5 clusters because our first presenter needs to go to another meeting directly after her presentation. But again, Mary Ann will be happy to meet with you individually if you have questions about her Great Books course. And I'll go ahead and turn it over to you.
I told Jonathan earlier that I've loved him since I've been here, and sometimes I love him better than other times.
Mary Ann, we're trying to take it to the meeting.
Can you hear me? No. Oh, well, he can hear me. Okay, now can you hear me? Mm-hmm. Okay, sorry. Jonathan asked me to work on the Great Books syllabus, and it was a task, to say the least. I've taught Great Books 1 for a long time, and I've taught FYX for a long time, and I know that INT is not FYS or X, and neither is the new Great Books 1 course, the regular Great Books 1, but I had to sort of figure all that out. When the writing guidelines first came down and we had the amount of time that we were supposed to spend on writing instruction and what we were supposed to spend, the percentage of the grade, I wasn't too overwhelmed because those of us who teach 101, there's several others here who do, even though it wasn't clearly articulated anywhere, we spent a lot of time on writing instruction, talking to the students about developing theses and, you know, a variety of other things. I already had, in terms of the percentage of grades, I had 60% on papers and 40% on dailies and participation. I had dailies and participation together. So if I took the dailies out, you know. So that part was the easy part. The hard part for me was to basically articulate what it is that I do and what I envision doing as we go along. Doug Thompson kept coming by my office as I was pulling my hair out, writing yet another revision of the syllabus for Jonathan, and he would say, well, just write what you do. Well, I've been here for a long time, and I don't usually write what I do. And so that was hard for me. And then I told Mary Rashko I was going to pick on her because Jonathan gave me her syllabus as a model. And I said, I can't do this. She has every minute planned out, and you know what instructions she's going to give under what conditions. So I'm going, and he said, there, you know, she probably isn't that structured, and you're really not as unstructured as you seem to be. So it's like, okay, I think I can get to a midpoint. So I think my major challenge with this was incorporating what the writing committee wanted, incorporating what in my heart is great books, and incorporating who I am as a teacher and how I teach most comfortably. And I think I've gotten to that point. I have a syllabus that's probably not as clearly defined maybe as some of the others, but it's something I can live with. And there are a couple places in the syllabus where I sort of have, as needed. And Jonathan's going, and you know, it depends. Sometimes I have a great books class, and I have, you know, one session on thesis development, and it seems like everyone gets it. And other times I have a class, and I have that same discussion 10 times, because nobody seems to get it. So part of my as needed depends on the nature and the personality of the class. So, you know, I understand the kinds of things that writing instruction requires, but exactly when I'm going to use them and how long I will be using them, that's the part that I can't, you know, put into a square box for me. There's one thing on the syllabus that wasn't clearly defined, and because I had a really early service learning workshop this morning, I didn't get the paperwork back to Jonathan in time, and he asked me to talk about it for a second. I have some sentence in there about a timeline activity. It's one of those things that I just happened upon one day, sort of out of desperation and trying to get the students to think about things. Sometimes students will automatically make connections between texts, and sometimes they don't. So sometimes we're on text 3 and they've forgotten that we've read Homer. I don't like for them to forget that we've read Homer. And so what I have several do is either in a small group first or have several go to the board and just sort of free flow write each text that we've read, and underneath that text write the kinds of issues that came up. So honor, courage, you know, stuff like that, and when we do the tragedies, other things. And then we sit back and we look at that and we start looking for connections. You know, how do the texts talk to each other? How does one text build from an earlier one? How can we take some of these themes that we have put on the board that we're all looking at now to help you all, you as students, incorporate you know, some of those issues into the papers you're writing. Again, I can't put it in a box, but it's something that comes out of a free flow time and is usually quite productive, because they'll say, oh, I didn't think about this theme, you know, coming up over here, and things like that. So I guess my parting words to you is that I'm not very structured. Jonathan has forced me to write a number of very structured things. I will do as I said, because they are things that I can live with. It can be done. It was difficult, and I will enjoy teaching the course very much. And I will be available at any other time if you want to talk to me. So thank you. Thank you.
Okay, I will say a few things about the actual syllabus, or the syllabus portion of this, where I have examples of activities and stuff toward the end. My example is English 263, which is the kind of classic early survey in the English department. There's two changes mainly that I'm making to this, or two large-scale changes. The first is that we're offering it as a Western Heritage class, not as a creative expression class. So I needed to think about, this was I guess last semester, but how this literature-based class could help us to understand important political, social, religious developments throughout this period, 1,000-year period of Western history in productive ways. So that's some of the work I'd already done, but then I needed to think about how writing assignments are going to really enhance that and come together with those goals. So it could be really scary insofar as then there is this body of literature that I'm accustomed to covering, and then there's also these more diverse genres that I wanted to bring in to make this a bit more in touch with history classes as well. So if anything, I gained material when I wanted to make this to fit the new gen ed. And then to put writing on top of it as well might look like kind of an impossible task. But what I really want to get out of this is to have some coverage, but also have a lot more depth. To have this be something where the students are really remembering important parts of the literature much better than they tend to do in the class they're taking with me right now. And that's because they're coming through this full development of reading the text, analyzing it together, and then testing their ideas about it through different writing projects. And I think that that's the way that they're going to learn the material most thoroughly. So I think that this is kind of an opportunity for them on a somewhat smaller body of literature to really comprehend the ideas that we're engaging with. So I was looking for, I think I just covered those two. Okay, so basically I wanted to have important political, social, religious moments, like I said, and I'll tell you which ones I isolated at that point. But then I also wanted to have a progression with our writing. I wanted to be able to start with some skills that I felt were more basic. So some basic analysis skills, thinking about doing very close reading of text, moving up to comparisons, and then into using secondary sources. So thinking about building an annotated bibliography, or writing a review of an article and ultimately culminating in a research paper. So those were the kind of things that I kept in mind. Like, what are the big thematic goals of the class, and then where do I want them to come to with their writing? So those ended up matching up in the following way that I'm going to try to explain to you more basically than what you see maybe in the course description, where you see the writing requirements. I wanted to make sure that we deal with the Anglo-Saxon invasions in Anglo-Saxon England, and along with that, then the conversion of the Anglo-Saxons to Christianity. So I picked some shorter poems that can help us to understand that issue, and then I chose one major writing assignment, their first analytical paper, to go along with that. Then when we move into the High Middle Ages and kind of some of the crises of culture that are happening then, the plague and the Peasants' Revolt and the Great Schism in the Church, I want another major writing assignment there, so they're really having to grapple with those issues. So there we're reading the Canterbury Tales, we're reading another more social text, and putting those together in a comparative writing assignment that can get them to think about the church at the time or the role of women at the time. Moving into the 16th century, we're working on The Faerie Queene to think about the Reformation and the growth of English nationalism. And so there is where we're going with this very complex text into some outside sources that can hopefully help them to make more sense of the allegory that they're dealing with there, so they really realize how it's about the Reformation and about nationalism and not just about King Arthur and some knights. So there we are doing the article review. And then finally, when we get to Milton, we can think about the English Civil War, we can think about Puritanism and these very diverse Protestant movements at the time, and that's where we get into a research paper. And we spend a good 4 weeks at the end of the semester reading through Milton and really taking time to do that kind of research. I did give you, like I said, an explanation of activities. I'm looking at the wrong sheet. This was with you in mind as an audience. It's really helpful to me. I'm going to be glad when I teach this that I have already mapped out something like this that I can play with. But mostly I was trying to think, how can I explain to other people what kind of writing activities I might do in the classroom? And how much do those look like normal discussion activities, and which ones are actually asking for real written documents in class? And I gave you a very pedantic glossary at the end so that you can see what I'm referring to when I make little notes about what we might do that day. One thing I want to point out is that on mine I did not have a final. I normally have a final in this class. And I think that somebody who's doing a more coverage-based class like this could definitely do a final in a writing-oriented class. I chose not to because I built mine so that all of the major works have a major writing assignment, and so it felt redundant to me. But I don't think that there's any reason why it couldn't be done the other way to have a final exam as well. And I think that I tend to like a lot of in-class writing activities, so you might be able to put in more material on some of the days that I've said in-class writing. But I wanted to give you an idea of kind of how I would address it, both through big picture and some of the daily activities. Thank you.
Keep wondering how I get myself into these situations. It's very different approaching this in terms of what should we as a faculty be doing to better prepare our students, and then to think about this is, how am I going to do this? Those are very different processes. In developing this syllabus, I've taught this course before from a number of different viewpoints and pedagogies. I've taught this course as a project-driven course with no exams, where the students write papers and do presentations, and I've taught this from a standard exam-based course standpoint. And so my approach to this was, why did I teach it those different ways, and how can I implement, what would that tell me about doing this? And what I came to the idea is, the way that I approach building a syllabus when I'm thinking about, what am I going to have students to do? The thing that comes into my mind is, how might I cover my content material that I need to cover in such a way that students are going to be able to demonstrate their learning of that material effectively, keeping in mind my instrument of measuring them. And so when I've taught this course from a project-driven way, I have taught it in such a way that they pick up gems that's going to help them to be prepared for those projects. When I taught it in an exam-based way, many cases I felt I'm preparing them for the exams that they're going to have to take. And so from thinking about teaching this as a writing instruction course, I really chose to focus on the fact that my method of evaluation, I'm going to make my primary method of evaluation the writing. And that's going to be their method of giving me back, demonstrating to me, have they learned the content within the proper context? And how can I prepare them to be able to do that for me? And so in doing this, one of the things I kept in mind in building the syllabus is I did not want this to appear as it appears on the registration sheet. There's a course with a 1-hour add-on. It can't be a course with a 1-hour add-on. It has to be one course. And in doing so, I tried to blend the language of what I was looking for mathematically with what I'm looking for writing. These are not opposing ideas. These are not opposing means. It is one method of delivery. And we're going to focus on that method of delivery. And so I pulled together the content that we as a department have agreed that should be a part of this course, and figure out, well, how can I cover my content and be able to have them demonstrate that they've learned that content. And so in attempting to do this, I blended those objectives, and I created something of a hybrid of what I would have did with this as a project-driven course. And so in teaching the content, one of the things that and you don't necessarily see this in the syllabus, but this was in my thinking of how I would arrange the material. I'm thinking part of teaching this as a writing instruction course is to get them to communicate their learning, to be able to explain to me the details that I might see in different ways with a different type of evaluation unit. And so moving content around so that areas that have similar types of explanation in terms of how to build structure, those components are moved together. And so you notice the numbering of the sections are scattered throughout for that reason. I have a different organization because I'm organizing things based upon what I'm trying to draw out of the student. And I use a variety of pre-writing methods based upon what's appropriate for the particular type of topic that I'm doing at the moment. So it's not, in every case I'm expecting an outline. There's no regiment. And so in certain cases, one of the ways I explained in the syllabus in terms of how do you write on a topic that's mathematical, well, first you work out the mathematical details. And then you figure out what did you just do. How do you best explain that? And so one of the pre-writing activities I have them to do is just working on the problem, getting into a group or individually, working on those problems together, figuring out the mathematical details, and then having a day where they have to stand up and explain what did they do. Having to explain to others what did you do and have others ask questions of them in that regard. And so they have to figure out, how do I communicate the solution? And that's where the pre-writing comes in, and the building of the drafts, and how do I communicate exactly what I'm trying to say. And so the course is built upon that sort of framework. And like I said, I use different activities for different situations. Certain situations I ask students to do a peer review, where I want them to communicate what they've done and have their fellow student give them feedback. Because one of the pitfalls that I have had in terms of reading papers from students in the past is they write the papers for me, and I know. And they don't believe me when I say, I can easily dumb myself down. This is really an easy task. You should ask my wife. If they know that their fellow student's going to read it, it tenses them up a little bit. I've used this in the past, and I found it a good technique. It's not necessarily something I'll use for every paper, and you'll notice in looking at my outline, I don't use the same technique each time. Because particularly as I move to different areas of mathematics within this course, it requires different skills. And I want them to reflect on those skills, but I also want them to see that there's some similarity in that preparation. The whole pre-writing process is not a regiment, it's doing what you need to do to build the product that you're trying to build. And so I have a variety in here, and in addition, I also included two shorter essays that you might notice is not included in the grade for the WRT course. So I separated out how those two grades would be measured. And I'm using the first essay, which is an autobiographical essay, basically explaining to me what's your mathematical background, what's your mathematical phobias. This gives me personal information about students that tends to help me to get to know who I'm teaching, but it's also going to give me some benchmark in terms of where their writing ability and where they are. And that's being followed up with a meeting with each individual student. Around about midtermish, there's another essay, short essay. This is on a mathematical topic, but again, this is sort of diagnostic. There's no, with the short essays, there's no pre-writing, there's no resubmits. It's just a one-time snapshot. And because of that one-time snapshot, I really didn't want to include that in my WRT. This is a personal choice. But I didn't want to include those diagnostic tools in the grade for the WRT. But I also, in the progression of the 5 projects that I included, there's pre-writing activities with the first 4. With the 4th one, while there's pre-writing activities, there's no opportunity to resubmit. And so I'm trying to demonstrate to them that we have a moving standard here. I'm expecting you to be getting better. There's no final, there's a final paper. So the final assignment occurs during that beginning of that last week of class, and this is your final. You're expected to do your own pre-writing. You're expected to do your own, I'm expecting you to demonstrate to me that which we spent the semester doing. And so I'm grading both your mathematical content, your progression as in the study of mathematics, but I'm also doing a progression of your writing. That's it.
Sorry. Okay, so when we were talking about how we in psychology would shift to the new gen ed curriculum, we realized with fewer courses that fit into the literacy block that we're in, but also fewer. Right now in gen ed, students take 2 courses from the social and behavioral sciences, and in the new gen ed, they'll take 1. And so we're assuming that our intro psych demand will be somewhat less. And that opens up some possibilities for us in terms of teaching some of the kinds of things that we'd like students to learn, but we don't really get to cover in intro psych as well as we might want to. And in thinking about how we could offer a writing course that didn't require any prerequisites, we hemmed and hawed and then thought about a way of incorporating not only writing but sort of critical thinking in a broad sense, and incorporating some of the goals that scientific inquiry has had about scientific literacy that we would like to see continued. So we were generating ideas. We pretty quickly realized that adding onto intro psych a writing component wasn't going to work, but that we could teach a new class that didn't require any previous experience in psychology. And so we decided to offer a special topics course at the 100 level that had only the INT 101 class as a prerequisite. So we expect that students will have some introduction to careful reading and writing, but not a whole lot. And that we would then be able to focus on that careful reading, writing, critical analysis within psychology. And so the special topic format lends itself very well to taking a topic and practicing reading about it and carefully writing about it in various genres. We thought we should probably begin with some general sort of introduction to not psychology in terms of topic, but psychology as an empirical science. And so there are a number of books out there. I just happen to like this particular one, and I've always wanted to add it to my intro psych class, but realized I would kill the students. Well, or the students would kill me if I did. But it covers some of the basic empirical foundations like falsifiability and operationalism and using statistics as a tool. So it doesn't really teach you a lot of fancy statistics, but the kind of probabilistic assumptions behind hypothesis testing, correlation versus experimental research, and the kinds of conclusions you can draw and cannot draw from each of those kinds of methods. And so we would begin with and this is not a really fat book, and it's not written with a lot of jargon. So students, it's a very accessible book, but we can march through these basic foundations and then apply it to a particular area. And so the syllabus that I created builds on my area of expertise, which is abnormal psychology, psychopathology, but actually I'm not going to be teaching this class. Bill's going to be teaching this the first time out, but I didn't, given that I'm on the writing committee, I didn't think I could make him quickly crank out a syllabus, so I did. So this doesn't have the usual sort of syllabus and disability statements, and it doesn't break down the what day we're going to be doing what, because I couldn't generate a lot of enthusiasm for a class I'm not actually going to teach. But I got more and more excited about the idea and the kinds of writing assignments and ways of taking students through this recursive, careful reading and reflecting on their own reading and analysis, and beginning with discussion and building their own confidence in their ability to read an original article and make sense out of it. This is something that our students will, I thought you guys were all laughing at me. I should have realized it was Gary. All right, should have realized. But these are skills that our students would benefit from throughout our curriculum. Even when we're teaching a seminar, a 400-level course, we pull our hair out about the difficulty our students have in reading and making sense out of articles, and then being able to put it in their own words and write about it succinctly, and to integrate one article with another and do critical analysis. Another important skill that students need, particularly in psychology, particularly when dealing with mental health issues, is the ability to differentiate science from pseudoscience and evaluate those kinds of claims that are out there in the media, particularly on the internet. And so we thought by having multiple opportunities to do these kinds of tasks, we'll build our students sort of scientific literacy, in that they'll be able to detect good websites from bad websites, and to see how the way we report scientific findings changes depending on whether it's the peer review article, then the report on that article that's aimed to a scientific psychology audience, to a more science audience, to a more general science but popular science, to a newspaper article, to pop psychology garbage that may be out there, and get them to be intelligent consumers of those, and ultimately to be able to write about psychology topics. Now, the APA manual is very dry, and basically a lot of it is teaching students how to write up, or teaching people how to write up the results of their own research. We're not going to have students write up their own research because they haven't taken any psychology classes. They're not going to be generating their own research. But we're hoping that they can use these skills when it comes to their research methods class, when they are gathering their own research, and to be able to write about it coherently. So I've put together some classic controversies in abnormal psychology that introduces students to careful reading and two sides of issues, so that they can evaluate the claims that each makes and evaluate the sort of scientific merit of each. They do the first one in discussing the myth of mental illness, and these are two articles, sort of classic from the 1960s, but introduce them to the notion of mental illness. And then two classic articles from the 1970s about people's ability to distinguish what's normal from abnormal. And we build on the debate and discussion about those original articles, and ask them to then actually dissect an article that has an introduction, a method, a results, and conclusion. And then we move to mental illness in the media and have them watch actually one fairly good movie, A Beautiful Mind, which is about the life of John Nash. Some of you may have seen it, and it actually has some pretty good aspects to it, but we're contrasted with a PBS actual documentary, and so they can see how sort of artistic license versus the more realistic discussion. To have them search on the internet for examples of good and not good information on a mental health issue and write up a description of the content and analysis of what made this one good and this one not good. We'll do some reading about individuals with mental illness from a historical perspective. So a short story that Charlotte Perkins Gilman wrote called The Yellow Wallpaper, which was originally published in 1892, along with her essay on why she wrote the short story, both of which depict her treatment for postpartum depression. And we can see how treatment of mental illness has changed from her era to the 1960s when John Nash was being treated, and then we'll look at the more modern era. Another voice of an individual with mental illness is Kay Redfield Jamison's The Unquiet Mind. She's an expert, she's a psychiatrist who's an expert on bipolar disorder, but she also suffers from bipolar disorder, so we'll see both sides there. And then we'll look at the actual psychological literature from both a case study and published reports. So we'll introduce them to the idea of mental illness from a variety of genres, expose them to writing from a variety of genres, and ask them, though, to write up in a genre that is giving them practice in summarizing and critically analyzing a peer review article that appears in various formats. So through this recursive process, hopefully by the end of the semester, they will feel confident that they could look at an article, figure out what the important parts were about the purpose of it, the method, the general results. Obviously, they're not going to be sophisticated about statistics, so we'll have to select the articles carefully, but then whether the conclusions that the authors made were appropriate for the kinds of research design that they used. And I think this will be a great foundation for them for subsequent courses that they take in psychology, but also in evaluating sort of broader media portrayals of individuals with mental illness. And I have a number of assignments which I'll go over when we break out into our small groups, but that was the basic idea behind the course.
Sorry. How's that? Loud enough? Sorry. Soft-spoken woman at the microphone. I want to echo something that Jonathan said at the outset, emphasizing the preliminary nature of what we're doing. But in my case, perhaps, it's all the more intense. See? I was afraid of that. Is that better? Okay. It's distracting having it that close. Sorry. It'll give me a good excuse for being momentarily lost in thought. All right. Bifocals, though, so let me just move my notes. What I wanted to say was that this particular task that I was given within the writing committee carried with it some slightly distinct challenges and opportunities. So I want to begin by acknowledging those and by saying at the outset that I see the sample that I'm sharing with you today as the next link in a chain that was begun by Bridget Trogdon in some of the material that she put together in earlier workshops. So what's here that's wonderful is integrative in the best sense, and whatever faults are here are mine alone. So that's the way I wanted to begin. The other thing that sort of manifests itself from that circumstance in the syllabus that you have is the fact that I felt like I couldn't really be of any use to you if I wouldn't also share some of the logic behind the choices I was making. So please forgive the excessive annotation and marginalia. I'm actually doing some scholarship on marginalia right now, so that probably predisposes me towards that, but it was there in a hope that whatever value you might see in individual activities that I've imagined my way through at this stage, you could at least see how I got there. So that I don't offer this as any sort of definitive example of what the class might look like, not even in my own teaching of it, but rather I'm trying to share the thought process that brought me to this moment that I can share with you. The other difference, I suppose, that I should emphasize is that unlike designing a syllabus to share today for a disciplinary course, I did not begin with content. Instead, I began with writing instruction and integrative learning as the two pedagogies that, at this point in our conversations, come together to give shape to this class to the extent to which it has a shape. And so what I did from that point was to try to move towards content that would serve, facilitate, and support these mutually reinforcing pedagogies. So I'm just going to point out a few places where I hope that that's visible on the sample that you have. For example, if you look on the second page of my syllabus, you'll see a couple of features that I drew in part from existing classes that I already teach, but I adapted them for these special circumstances of the new INT 101. So for example, where you see daily course goals for student reading and writing, I'm one of those professors who sees the syllabus not as a fearfully binding contract, but at least as a promise. And as such, I try to signal to my students what they can expect in the course. And I try to hold myself pretty much accountable to that promise. And the reason, therefore, for having something like daily course goals for student reading and writing is to signal in this instance that this is a class dedicated to writing, and that reading and writing are inextricably linked. I know that we all know that, but given my experience teaching writing over more years than I really would like to reckon up in front of all of you, I've come to understand that students don't always enter having that realization. So this is my way of trying to signal to the students that this is something important to the course. And on a first day, I would actually talk about that. I don't read my syllabus to students. I don't imagine I'm that interesting, but I do highlight certain moments, and I imagine that this would be one that I would want to draw their attention to. The next thing that I would call your attention to, is on the first page of my notes, kind of a logical problem there, sorry about that, has to do with the way the writing assignments here have been imagined and constructed. So that I tried to find ways that students could not only write about or from within the various domains that give shape to this class, but also I tried to imagine ways that I could use writing to elucidate the domain, and by the same logic, to use the domain to elucidate writing. In other words, it wasn't just writing instruction and integrative learning itself, along with self and other, that I was trying to bring together and integrate. I was trying to think of a way in which the domain and the act of writing could move back and forth intellectually for the student, one reinforcing the other, all at the freshman level, of course. So this is a very preliminary step in the direction, but nonetheless a crucial one, since this is their introduction to a kind of culture of writing at Mercer that the new Gen Ed program is designed to create. All right, I guess the only other major thing I want to talk about is to give you a specific example before we break up into groups. And so if you'll turn in the syllabus to the description of the assignments, which is a few pages in, not yet at the schedule, but let's see, where is it? Hang on. Oh, it's 1, 2, fourth page in? Under grades, it actually is, I'm sorry. What I wanted to introduce there is, in the marginalia, you can see the thinking behind each of these assignments and how I'm imagining them serving the task of both integrative learning and writing instruction. The one I particularly wanted to call your attention to is paper 3. This is one of the 3 scaffolded assignments or writing assignments done in stages, and I've never done something like this before because I've never taught a class that invited me to teach across the domains. But what I'm imagining for this particular assignment that I'm hoping will be useful is the idea that in the rhetorical analysis, what I'm going to ask them to do is read 2 different domains' treatment of a single topic, and therefore their writing assignment will not be so much a report on the issue, but rather a rhetorical analysis, a kind of tracking out of the alteration that the issue or the topic undergoes as a result of its presentation through the rhetoric and the forms that are associated with and appropriate to these distinct domains. So they're still going to be making an argument, but their argument is both specific to the domains and larger than any one domain because it's asking them to make an argument about the rhetorical effects of that domain. So just to give you a sense of where my head is with regard to that idea. The last thing I want to say in this little brief encounter is that for all of the assignments that I imagined for the syllabus, I found myself looking for ways that I could use writing both as a means of discovery and exploration, and as Keith said earlier in discussing his, and Miranda and Mary as well, and as a means of them demonstrating what they've understood. So I guess that makes this class a particularly integrated ball of integration. And so if it works, that would be great. I guess the last thing I want to say is that I think to a certain degree, we do this already. Writing suffuses so much of what we do with our students across the domains. I can't speak as a scientist, and trust me, you wouldn't wish me to. Not yet. I'm working on that. But I can't help but believe, based on my experience in the academy, that I think it's a question of articulating what we already do, as Mary Ann said at the very beginning, and of encouraging students to recognize what they already do, the skills that, yes, we need to develop further, but that they bring with them and that are crucial to their success regardless of which major they choose. So, that's it for me.
All right. Wanted to make a few comments about my English 237 Literature and Film course, to talk about why I chose that one and how I changed it from the version that I taught for the first time last spring. A little bit about the course. It's not technically a special topics course, but it's not a coverage course either, in that I don't feel obligated to cover all literature and all film. But the idea is to give students exposure to and depth in particular examples so that they can work out through specifics more general tendencies they can transfer to other media. And when I taught this last spring, I was not particularly satisfied with the course for a number of reasons. One is, for the first time in over a decade, I did not require students to write dailies. Dailies are something I learned in teaching great books courses, having students write 2 questions about the reading material and a page or more length response to one of those questions. I do that in FYS, I do that in my survey of English Lit, I do that in my 300 level English courses. For a number of reasons. One, this is the first time I taught it. 2, I expected at least 30 students in this class because of its popularity in past semesters. And 3, all the books I had assigned I had never read before. I thought I was, which was not a really wise decision, but exciting. A lot of adrenaline in this class. I thought I would back off on that and just have 2 short papers, a midterm and a final, and then some class participation. What I was really disappointed and should have foreseen happened was students often didn't do the reading. They didn't come into class with many thoughts about it. They didn't have any really incentive to have done the reading because their expectation would be they would come in, I would give a lecture, I would tell them what they should have paid attention to, they can go back and check it if they need to, and the course really, with some very bright students who made the course for me and helped but the other students, you waited for those students to answer any questions. And so the effect was, I think, the overall learning in the course was a lot lower than I would have liked it to be. And so one reason I chose this course was to increase that opportunity for all of the students in the class to learn, to be required to demonstrate it, which I think will be much more beneficial to them in terms of their learning. You've seen a range of approaches to how to do the fourth hour in the syllabi that you've seen. What I did here is expand it so that I have two 75-minute classes and then added 25 minutes to each of them, so that I have 200-minute classes that meet from 3 to 4:40 2 days a week. In a film course, my thought is that it would benefit my ability to actually show clips and talk about them and do a number of things, a number of different types of teaching in a class and different types of activity. And so in the example that I give on the syllabus, and I'll talk about that in a minute. Well, I'll do it now, so in the interest of time, so that you can make sure and have a breakout session. If you look on the third page, actually the fourth page, the syllabus component. In our third class meeting, I want to repeat something I attempted last time I taught the course, but do it better. I give the students a copy of a short story by Roald Dahl called Lamb to the Slaughter, and as well as a teleplay by Dahl that he wrote for the Alfred Hitchcock Presents TV series in the late 50s, early 60s. This was a particular episode that Hitchcock himself directed. So you have what might be the optimal example of adaptation of literature to film, because you have the author's text, the author involved with the screenplay, which rarely happens, and then a masterful director bringing it to the screen. And so if you're going to assume that a good adaptation needs certain factors, this would seem to have it all going for it. So first we discuss the story, incorporating their questions and insights from their dailies, which they will have bring with them to that class. Then we'll view an adaptation of the story for television. It's available on YouTube, which is awfully handy. And while viewing the film, I don't want them just to sit passively and watch it, but to take notes on certain particular things. Changes in the plot, changes in the dialogue, changes in the tone, and particularly changes in their reaction to the story, because we will have talked about how they view the plot is. There's a pregnant wife whose husband, a police officer, comes home and tells her he's leaving her for another woman. She gets a frozen leg of lamb out of the freezer and hits him over the head with it and kills him. And then to dispose of the evidence, she cooks the lamb and serves it to the police officers who come to investigate. So she gets away with it, at least in the story. And generally the reaction to the wife is not particularly favorable. She's the victim, but she's a murderer. And so then we talk about how Hitchcock rigs the effect on the viewer, because it's Barbara Bel Geddes playing the wife, and a particularly young and baby-faced Barbara Bel Geddes. So she's much more sympathetic, not just in the casting, which makes a difference, the visuals matter, but also in terms of her voice, in terms of her body language, in terms of the changes that they make in the story to make her more sympathetic. And also to imply that maybe she doesn't get away with it, because that's also part of the rules of television in 1960. You can't really show, even put upon wives getting away with murder. So we discuss, so they take notes, they meet in small groups to share their observations. Each group presents to the larger group their observations, so trying to build in a sense of not just viewing, but active viewing, engaged viewing, sharing of observations to build a context for our discussion. And then this will also be the topic of their first paper. They'll talk about the adaptation of this particular story into a film. So it's giving them raw material for their first paper. And the idea in our discussion as a group is to bring out how different media, how different audiences. It was a story published in a British magazine, set in England, and then changed to California in the TV version. The situation, the conventions, the expectations, how all of these things matter in terms of what's changed and why. And we tie that in with the book that we were reading, Cahir's Aesthetic Rubric for Film Translations of Literature, which is a guide he gives for how do you tell a good adaptation from a bad one. And so try to put together, to integrate the writing, the material, their critical thinking in a way which is more beneficial and more deeper education than they had received the first time when I pointed out these things to them, but didn't really engage them as much. And I give another example, which I'll be happy to talk about in the breakout sessions. How's that for a segue? I'll be breaking you out in just a second. For Pride and Prejudice, which I have done before. And I taught an upper level course on adaptations of Austen and Dickens novels. So we read the novel, we looked at a couple of film adaptations. In this particular class, I'll look at 4 different adaptations of a particular scene. And so talk about how do you evaluate them, and what do you notice, and how is it an adaptation and interpretation. Okay, so this is going to be a little awkward, but what I'd like to do is to have the presenters move out to various areas in the room, and then, I guess, close to the chairs, and then have you bring your chair to the person you want to ask more questions of, to talk to more. So it's sort of an Iowa caucus type of effect. And we'll see how this goes. So thank you very much for coming.